Parinda is well known to the Shop Your Fit community already. But just for those of you who are just joining, and this might be the first time, Parinda is the VP of Strategy and New Growth Ventures at Macy's. She leads all the new growth ventures where they identify new revenue streams and customer acquisition models. But Parinda, tell us in your own words a little bit more about it. What does that mean? What are you focused on, and what is your team focused on?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. So I have been with Macy's for almost 3 years now, and I've always played in this innovation sort of growth space, coming from media prior to retail. And the idea was really about forward thinking. How do we look and plan for tomorrow's customers, tomorrow's viewers, tomorrow's readers, and how do we make sure that we're continuously engaging them in the way that makes most sense? And how do we make sure that we can continue to have a pipeline of ideas and sort of make our brand as relevant today or as relevant tomorrow as it is today, and continue to think about ways to drive new profitable revenue streams, and really start thinking about flipping things on its head as our customers' preferences and ways of shopping continue to change.
So, and what you mentioned, you came from media before this. So what brought your attention to the fashion industry and to trying to bring innovation to, such a company like Macy's?
Yeah, so I think, innovation and business development, that existed in media for a very long time, particularly in the digital space. I think technology was always at the forefront of what was happening with media. So you had to constantly be thinking about what's next and how are you going to evolve your business to make sure that your customers or your readers can consume content in a completely new way. And content was the product in media. I think for retail, it's been a little bit of a slower growth to change. One, retailers didn't have to move as quickly. I think some particularly legacy brands were doing very well, and they had their brick and mortar and digital and sort of omni experience that was driving their business and was sustainable at the time. And I think, I have a lot of respect for Jeff Gannett, our CEO, who was forward thinking to say, we need to be thinking about tomorrow in a very serious way, and it needs to be a full-time opportunity. It can't be every internal stakeholder thinking about it separately and hoping that in their free time they're implementing change. And so at the time, about 3 years ago, Jeff was putting together this innovation team, and I was fortunate to come, and they had reached out, and I had never thought about retail as I was very loyal to the media industry, had been in media for 10 plus years. And, there was something exciting about creating this environment in a retail space. And from a personal perspective, I had worked very much in the digital world, and now kind of taking that to digital plus physical, and really kind of thinking about that customer journey and the impact that you can have from evolving your business was exciting. And so it was an opportunity to think about how fashion could benefit from new business models and new ways of engaging your customer.
But I can also imagine that when Jeff actually started thinking about this 3 years ago when you came on board, it was one company, and now it's a completely different company in the roadblocks, in the structure, also in how well accepted new technologies and ideas are. So with your experience and with a lot of people that are listening, trying to implement and trying to change with everything that is changing, what are the big takeaways that you have into probably having to change really fast to adapt to what's coming?
Yeah, so I think, it's funny. I think it's a personal challenge of mine to work with industries that are struggling. And it's almost a little bit of, for me personally, it's exciting because I think the opportunity to reinvent yourself and evolve is almost becomes low-hanging fruit. because you know that there's a lot you can do. I think your biggest challenge when you think about legacy companies is that their brand is so meaningful and there's so many internal stakeholders that are innovating themselves. I would never say that we're a group that's an isolated group that's innovating. I think everyone needs to be innovating in a company. But the reality is when you have every stakeholder and every function within a large corporation innovating on their own and doing these small things, the impact becomes very minimal, and you have no idea and no visibility at the corporate level of what's happening within the company. And so I think some of your biggest roadblocks, personally, working with a legacy company often is taking stock of what's happening in the rest of the company and making sure you have a group that can actually pull all of that stuff together. And then secondarily, I think it's prioritizing and saying, how do I actually align what we're trying to achieve with the company's strategic priorities? And I think that gets lost a lot often at big companies when you have consultants coming in or you have separate innovation groups that are working in isolation to say, we want to do X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't align directly with the strategic priorities of the company. You're never going to get buy-in from a company if you work in isolation. So making sure that you have the buy-in from the company, your executive team, but then also your stakeholders that are going to help you execute on some of these ideas. And then I think the third thing is that I think is really important is not trying to innovate for the sake of innovating, but really making sure that you're addressing a customer pain point. What is it that you're trying to solve for? Do we as a brand have the authenticity to play in that space if we're trying to evolve something? And what is that going to look like? Is this something that's profitable that we can, so really being very thoughtful and diligent about putting together the business case and sizing the opportunities that you're going after. Even though it might be a pilot to start with, does this have the possibility to scale? And what does that look like? And that then ultimately allows you to prioritize what you want to go after. And you can go after things that are meaningful to the company, that align with your executive team's strategic priorities, but then also gives you you do have a dedicated team that can go after it and run with it in a way that you may not be able to do if you didn't have that team that was focused on innovation.
Absolutely. And you mentioned two things that are really important. I think that being aligned with the company strategy is key because it doesn't matter in which direction you're going if it's not aligned. We hear a lot of stories about companies trying to push for innovation, but then nothing happens. And I think that a big part of that comes because of that they want to innovate, but the group that's innovating, it might not be aligned so much with the strategy of the company as they are with innovation on its own. But the other thing that you mentioned that to me is super interesting is the customer pain points. Especially now, it seems that because of COVID, because of what's happening, some of those customer pain points are going to change, are changing. So what are some of the takeaways or what are some of the key pain points that you think the industry has right now that are to be addressed? And which ones do you think probably weren't there and are there now because of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think logistics, the impact that COVID has had on our logistics and supply chain has been pretty significant. And I think when you have your entire customer base, particularly for a brand that has brick and mortar and digital, and now everything was being pushed to digital, the strains that it has on your digital or your e-commerce business in general, I think was probably the first area of opportunity to think about how do we get things to customers quickly, how do we change the general customer experience online, because now there's more discovery that's happening online that was normally potentially happening in our stores, where people had the opportunity to touch and feel and try things on and talk to someone that can give them some guidance, and all of that was stripped away very quickly. And so how do you evolve your online business to make sure you can address some of that? So do you have clienteling tools? Are you using your customer service agents in a more meaningful way that they're now selling agents and not just answering reactive questions, but proactively trying to help your customer base? Are you trying more immersive technology to allow customers to try things on, to see how things, to visualize their space or visualize their content in a different way? And I think it was certainly forcing, and then everything that you would do from a convenience perspective, from a pickup and curbside pickup and all of that, I think was sort of table stakes. I think every brick and mortar company, if you weren't doing that very quickly, you were losing your customers. But I think the other piece that was really interesting with COVID is that, for Macy's, we have an older customer base. And now all of a sudden, our e-commerce strategy was very much geared, and our marketing, and I think a lot of retailers could relate that, it was very targeted to a younger customer base. And that's how it has traditionally been. And now you look at an environment like COVID, where your older customer base is being forced to use things like Instacart and online online grocery delivery. And if they're being forced to use this and it becomes easy for them and they find some comfort in it, does your online customer base all of a sudden shift in that now you're messaging to a younger customer base, but you may actually have quite a few older customers now more comfortable online? And so how are you evolving your messaging and your communication and your experience for that customer?
But is this a temporary thing? Do you believe that after COVID that people are going to go back to the stores, that they're going to shop the same way they did before? Or which parts, as you dissect the buyer's journey, do you think it's going to remain and which one won't?
Yeah, so I would say that I think people are naturally social beings, and so to say that they're not going back in the store would be wrong. I do think that people will want to go back in the stores, but are they going to do exactly what they did before? I don't think so. I think there is, at least initially, I would say there's probably, I think it's referred to as the COVID hangover. And I think in this hangover period, people might go into stores, but they're going to be very resistant about touching everything, about keeping distance, and that might last for 6 to 12 months post any sort of normalcy. And I think people will go into the store, but there's going to be a different way of shopping. So does that mean there's more opportunity for a showroom type of model? Do you need to have as much inventory in your stores? And can you have less, but then people aren't going to take product home? It's just going to be shipped to them. Things like that I think are top of mind right now in terms of how does the in-store experience change. And when you look at it on the back end, also from an operations perspective, I think the reality is that COVID has put a lot of strain financially on big retailers and department stores and anyone that really is running a brick and mortar business. And so if the go forward strategy is that you need fewer people to help operate stores, what does that do to the store experience? Does that mean you're going to have less? Does your footprint change? Do you sort of showcase things differently? And so I think the in-store experience will exist, but it will be very different. I think online, there's a level, kind of alluding to my earlier point, that if COVID has now lended itself to drive greater convenience online, and people are comfortable with that convenience because they're getting things the way that they're okay with getting 3 pairs of shoes and returning 2 because the retailer has made it very easy for them to do that, then I do think that you'll continue to drive your e-commerce business, and that will become a significant channel, bigger than your physical channel of shopping. And I think it's going to put a lot of focus and potential sort of stress on the business to continue to evolve that experience, because you're competing with a whole lot of more players that are out there from an e-com perspective than having a physical footprint.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of, and I think that one challenge that we all face right now that you probably do as heading innovation is that you see all these technologies, all these solutions, and potentially you don't know which ones are an actual solution for a specific thing. If you remember that a lot of people that are on the webinar are own brands, they have small and medium brands. So if you think of what are the biggest pains and what are the best solutions that you've seen so far, how would you classify those two? Which ones would you put your money on?
So, it's interesting. I think that we meet with a lot of companies, and I would say in the last year, in 2019, as a team of, and we have a fairly small team, it's a team of 7 or 8 people, we probably met with over 1,600 companies. And we have a very good ability to sort of filter through those companies. And I would say that there's a few things that we're looking for, without saying which companies we think are sort of headed for success and which ones aren't. I think there's a couple things that are really important as we sort of work with partners or work with brands. And one of the big things is how enterprise ready are they? And I think one of the biggest challenges is that you will find a company that's really amazing and doing incredible things from a tech perspective and will do great for a pilot. But then ultimately our whole goal in doing any sort of pilot is the ability to scale it. And that could be physically or digitally. And does that company have the ability to scale at the level that you need them to, and as quickly as you would need them to, if the pilot is successful? So I think that is really important, and something that we keep in mind and look for. I think the other piece that's really important is context, and I think, if I take an example of the customer service place, I think a lot of big department stores or retailers are continuously trying to evolve how to optimize customer service. And how do you continue to give your agents the right tools to make sure that they know a lot about their customers, they know all of the entire customer journey? And if you look at that space, I've probably met with 15 different companies in that space. And I would say there's some that are cream of the crop and are doing amazing things. And I would say that if you look at them in isolation, that company X would be phenomenal. But then when you have to look at it in context of saying someone like a Macy's is not ready to overhaul its entire system. So you have to find the right company. That there might be company B that might not be as great as company X, but that company B can work with your existing tech stack. And they can integrate in a more meaningful or seamless way. And that all of a sudden becomes more important, because you have to recognize that a lot of these older retailers have a lot of antiquated systems, and they're stitched together with over time with a lot of through acquisition and through mergers, and that system isn't going away. It's evolving slowly, but it's not going away. So how do you work within that technology system so that you can compete and be meaningful and do it in a time frame that makes sense for that company? And I think it's things like that become increasingly important. And it's less so about what feature set that company has to offer.
So, and it seems that being a legacy brand like Macy's gives you a lot of opportunities, but a lot of challenges as well, like what you were mentioning around how all the new technologies, how do they coexist with the existing ones. So it seems that gives a lot of opportunities for small, medium brands to actually differentiate themselves, because they don't have the problem of scaling probably as much. If they do a pilot with a small technology company that just started, the level of scalability that's going to come afterwards, it's probably not going to be what it would happen with Macy's. So if you take your Macy's hat off or your enterprise hat off, and if you were thinking of you as a small or medium brand, where do you think they have the ability to differentiate themselves in moving faster? What areas do you think are key?
So I think it's, I think one of the biggest challenges that I would say small to mid-sized companies have is they're trying to do too much at once. And it's prioritizing which ones that will have the biggest impact for your business, because you just don't have the time or resources to start working on 5 different initiatives that will all require similar technology inputs or just people or stakeholders that will need to get involved. And so I think one of the biggest missteps with some of the smaller to mid-sized companies is really being thorough about the business cases, and really start with what are you solving for, and what are you trying to achieve with this, and what will a pilot be able to do, and what are the KPIs that I'm measuring. And if you are stay true to that, and that has to be your holy grail, and making sure that if it's not achieving what you want it to achieve by the time frame that you've set out to it, either shut it down or iterate quickly. And so having a little bit of that startup mentality of being agile and quick and implement, it's never going to be perfect. And so trying to plan for perfection is also not the extreme you want to go in, but making sure that you can say, okay, I'm looking at these 5 initiatives that I really want to go after, but I know that these 2 are going to have the biggest impact if it were to go in the direction that I believe it will go in, and if I were to scale in the way that I want to, I think this would drive X dollars to my bottom line. Then that should be your guiding principle on which ones you start really focusing on. And is it really going to move the needle for your business? And I think trying to prioritize a little bit and focusing on the one or two things that you think could help evolve your business is the way to go. And just being diligent about the review of the pilot, because I think, for a big company, and putting on my Macy's hat for a second, we often fall victim of saying we'll run 100 pilots and no one's tracking them. And all of a sudden you forgot that this pilot was even running. And so we have to be better about closing the loop on some of that stuff and making sure that if it's not working, that's okay. Fail fast and iterate and start over. And I think there's that startup mentality is one that we've embraced very much so in our team, and saying, be agile, be quick, be thorough about what you think it's going to drive for your business, but then move as quick as you can, but be very focused on what you're trying to achieve, how you're going to achieve it, and when you'll turn it off if it doesn't make sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to deep dive a little bit into, you've talked a lot about how you talk to your customer, how your customer service agent becomes sales agent, especially given the environment that we're in. Have you seen any stories that you particularly enjoyed of companies adapting in this sense in the past few months that you can think of?
I think the luxury space has been very, very interesting right now when you look at just sheer numbers. I mean, it is mind-boggling to see that luxury has not had as significant of a negative impact on sales as sort of traditional retailers have. And I'm not quite sure why like handbags are continuing to sell in a time when where are people using their handbags? I'm not sure, but they're doing well. And so, I think there is something to be said about luxury has evolved a lot from clienteling and sort of setting the groundwork for that already pre-COVID and really having strong customer touch points. And I think they were probably more easily able to extend some of the technology that they were using from a clienteling perspective to their customer service, and making sure their customer service wasn't only used to sort of answer questions on fixing things or where stores are located and these basic questions, but really evolving their top agents to be active sellers and allowing them to provide the details and really client service that you would want your agents to sort of pick up in a time like this. And I think again, they're at different price points, and so their customer is obviously very different, and was not necessarily as impacted from a slowing down of a shopping perspective or their journey online, but they are going online now for these products as opposed to being in store. And I think luxury is sometimes an emotional purchase. And so the fact that they have been able to convert some of that online is pretty incredible.
That makes sense. And I want to, for those of you that are watching, if you want to ask some questions, you can put them on the chat, and our moderator or administrator will share them with me for me to ask Parinda. In the meantime, I'd like to ask one or two more questions.
Absolutely.
We start wrapping it up for questions. So, what are some of the companies or some of the initiatives that you've seen through COVID that are on your radar that you felt particularly, whether they make sense for Macy's or not, that you felt that they were interested in which directions they took it?
Yeah, so I think well, one, I will say some of the brands, a lot of digitally native brands that stood out right away for COVID were ones that had very strong narratives, and they connected with the community in a time where people were scared. And I would say the same thing would hold true in this post sort of or in this environment where we're seeing a lot more protests and people's voice want to be heard. And I think in this environment, companies that are taking a stronger stance around their narrative and making actionable or sort of putting their brand on the line and saying, we're going to change, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and hold us accountable to it. Things like that were really impressive. So I would say a brand like Rothy's, I thought was very impressive. They were probably one of the first to come out and say, we're going to use the way that we make shoes to make masks. And I think connecting online with that customer base that does care a lot about sourcing a product and then seeing them sort of reinvent themselves very quickly, I thought was very, very meaningful. I would say, I'm still a follower of food and media. And I would say even a brand that is a legacy brand, but one like Bon Appetit, who, kind of their editor-in-chief stepped down post some of the protests, but their reaction to coming back with a very strong message to say, this is how we're going to evolve, and these are the things that we're going to do, and how our site is going to change was meaningful. And it's one that I remember. And I think as a consumer of that content, and kind of looking at it, like, those are the things that resonate with you. Or, it's very easy to send to put out a virtuous message that sometimes you need to, as a brand, to say we're connected, we're aligned. But the ones that are taking it one step further and taking action against it is incredible. And I think that is has been really, really great to see. I would say specifically ones that I think are resurrecting themselves, resurrecting their technology. I think a lot in supply chain, the DoorDashes of the world have really stepped up and changed the way that they operate to try to accommodate more categories, as well as really thinking about how do we sort of, it's a meaningful time for logistics and getting things to customers at a faster pace. How do you sort of continue to expand that? And I would say, fit. I think fit is one that a company like Macy's really struggled with, because we didn't necessarily see the benefit of using fit technology pre-COVID. It just was not a priority. It wasn't perfect. And I think customer preferences were still guiding a lot of the decisions around how things fit, as opposed to actual measurements. But then all of a sudden you can't try things on anymore. And so you had to start thinking and evolving the types of technology that you were using to make sure you can deliver a similar customer experience online that you once had in store.
So along those lines, and I don't see any questions so far, but I have a good one for that, is what does a fitting room of the future look like? If you think of 2-3 years down the road, it feels like this, which was already a lot of options were coming up. We at Happier Fit are working a lot of that, obviously. But then it seems like this just sped that up quite a bit. So where do you think this is going to go in 2 or 3 years in the fitting room side?
Yeah, so it's so interesting, because I think, so I would kind of break that into different categories. I think fitting rooms of soft content like clothing, apparel, I have a hard time believing that's going to come back in the way that it was. I just cannot imagine right now. And again, people do forget and things do change. So maybe 2 years from now, some version of it will come back. But right now, I have a very hard time believing that will be the way that people are comfortable trying stuff on. So I think existing fitting rooms are kind of done with. So interestingly, I think an opportunity for some of these brands is, how do you reutilize that asset in a creative way? So could you create new mirrors or new virtual fitting room, which at the time, I mean, I know that there are retailers that tried it, they weren't used a lot, but now knowing the environment, will those actually do better because people don't want to try things on? I think when you look at the hard goods and like metals and things like watches and jewelry, because that's, in my mind, from what I've read, metal holds on to some of this, to COVID for a longer period of time, or any sort of infectious disease. And so how are people going to be comfortable trying that on? And is this an opportunity for immersive technology, VR, AR, to play a bigger role for a try-on, and for some of those types of goods, handbags, some of that stuff? And do you start implementing some of that at a quicker pace than you would before?
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, Parinda, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the time that you took. I think that it was extremely useful. I think that most of us can really are having a few takeaways, especially how we iterate on testing new things. I think that you at Macy's came in and you have all these things that are coming on your plate on potential technologies, but thinking about what is aligned with their strategy, first of all, and then how you track that, and to actually, in your case, it might not be the case for a small company, how that scales with the company if it moves forward, but obviously having very clear KPIs on, how we're going to test this and how long, and focus on a few things. I think that those are my big takeaways that I'm taking notes of. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with us.
No, I mean, I would just say, I think I would say that don't get carried away by evolving technology around you unless it serves a bigger purpose. And in making sure that you're really solving something specific for your customer is really important, because there's a lot of shiny objects out there, and you can really easily get swayed into saying, oh, we should be playing in this space, or we should be trying this. And I think it's important to keep a pulse on it to say, how is it continuing to evolve? But making sure that you start with the what am I solving for, I think is so important, because it's very easy to get distracted in an environment where there's continuously new technology that's popping up, and that is remarkable. And I think it's if you have ever been to like the Consumer Electronics Show, it almost becomes that every day when you're seeing all of this new stuff come around you. But making sure that you have a very clear understanding of what your strategic priorities are, and how are you going to align some of the innovation and newness that you want to bring into your company with your strategic priorities, and not losing sight of that.
I think that that's a very good takeaway. And we'd like to close it now. But Parinda, thank you so much for the time. I think that it's amazing that you came from a different industry, and what you've done in the past 3 years at Macy's, and actually evaluating all these different alternatives that probably was kind of somewhere in there as a pillar for Macy's, but now more than ever, your work is probably crucial to the company. So congratulations again. Thank you very much for the time. And we hope to see everybody in our next webinar.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.